Do not waste your life. Some of you may recognize that as the title of a sermon that John Piper, and it eventually became a book, preached many years ago. And in it he challenged a bunch of the next generation, at that time anyway, I think it was in the early 2000s, to live a life that is not wasted. Don't get caught up in the American dream of live, save, retire, move to Florida, and collect seashells. Was one of his examples, at least in the book. There's another man that lived his life well, that was martyred, named Jim Elliot. I mentioned him this morning. Jim Elliot was a man that wanted to witness in the jungles of Ecuador to the tribes there, and he eventually, along with 4 other men, was speared to death. But he had a famous quote, at least it used to be a famous quote in the Christian circles. I don't know if it is anymore. But he'd say this a lot, according to his wife Elizabeth, who wrote about his sacrifice after he was martyred. He said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." He is no fool to give what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Eliot was speaking of the foolish choice that so many make today, so many Christians even make today, of choosing what they think will be blessings here in this world over the true eternal blessings of the next. So how does one give up eternal blessings for the sake of earthly? How does one waste their life, as John Piper famously wrote a book about and preached a sermon on to young men and women some 26 years ago? You waste your life if you're living for yourself. One will waste their life. It is lived for themselves and not for the glory of the Lord and for others. There is a word that is seldom used in Christian circles, and our family was reminded of again as we didn't work all the way through. We're still working through the Advent book on 1 Corinthians 13 by Sinclair Ferguson. But in one of his days of when he was speaking about love, he said there's a word in our modern Christian day that has come on hard times, and that is sacrifice. Sacrifice. Paul's already pointed out in our epistle, one that is a grumbler. We looked at this last week. One that grumbles is not living a life that is sacrificial. Because a person that grumbles, a person that complains about their circumstances, what are they ultimately saying? I'm not getting what I want. It's about me, and I'm not getting what I want. I will not live sacrificially for others because my needs are not being met. Is that not a grumbler? Sacrifice. To give up something for the sake of gaining something better. It could also be defined in negative for the sake of this sermon. Sacrifice. One could make a wrong sacrificial choice that it will put their health in jeopardy for the sake of pleasure. One could sacrifice their integrity for fame, or comfort, or ease in the moment. But it is a term that has fallen on hard terms as far as living a sacrificial life for others. It is a term that used to be in the Christian circles not too long ago used when we were talking about sanctification, when we were talking about growth in the Lord, when we were talking about what we're looking at in Philippians, how to live a life that is not wasted, how to live a life that is worthy. Elizabeth Elliot wrote about it in her book, The Shadow of the Almighty, when she wrote about the sacrificial life of her husband Jim. Gladys Allward often spoke about the sufferings and the sacrifices of young Christians in China whom she was a missionary to. I often think of C.T. Studnow, who was an English cricket player who gave up fame and fortune, literally let it go through his hands and gave it away so he could go serve as a missionary. He wrote a challenging little tract during that time about professing Christians being chocolate soldiers rather than real ones. What was he saying? He said they would melt if things got too hot. Why? Because they weren't willing to sacrifice. Amy Carmichael, who was the one that went to India and helped rescue little girls and boys out of the caste system, wrote a little book called If, to challenge believers. It was a bunch of statements that started with the words, if I, and ended with the words, then I know nothing of Calvary love. Her message was the same. If sacrifice is not at the heart of your life, then you know nothing of the love that was on full display at Calvary. Isaac Watts' most famous hymn, maybe second to Joy to the World, speaks of this as well, which is nowadays titled, When I Surveyed the Wondrous Cross. What did Watts conclude when he pondered the love that was displayed at Calvary? Love so amazing, love so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Watts before that says, I could have the whole world, I could own the whole universe, and that wouldn't be enough to thank Jesus for what he's did. The only thing I can thank him with is a sacrificial life lived for him. A sacrificial life lived for him. All of creation, Watts said, is a present far too small. If I had it all. Paul knew what he was talking about in Romans chapter 12, doesn't he? It's not by accident that after 11 chapters of Paul proclaiming the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ and who he is and everything he's done, Paul starts with the shift in Romans with what? I appeal to you, therefore, in Romans 12:1, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a what? Living sacrifice. Holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world. Don't be pressed into what this world wants you to be. Don't be pressed into its mold, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And you know what Paul says right after that? Don't think too highly of yourselves. That's what he's saying here in Philippians. What's 1 Corinthians chapter 12 all about? God has given you talents. He's given you a spiritual gifting. For the sake of you to promote yourself? No. For the sake of others within the church. To be sacrificially used for the interest of others. He's doing the same thing here in Philippians. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not look out for his own interest, but also the interest of others. Sacrifice. It'll take sacrifice. If you want to live for others, you will have to sacrifice something in your life. If you faithfully give, you're giving something up so you can give. Financially, time, whatever. If you give, you're giving something else up. You must sacrifice your own interests. You must put your interests aside for the sake of others. It sounds easy on paper, doesn't it? It sounds easy when you read it. Oh, sure, I'll live a sacrificial life. Wait a minute, it's going to cost me that? I'm not sure I want to do that. How many of us truly want to give up our own preferences? It's hard. It would be impossible without God. Because we don't want to live a sacrificial life, because that means we have to put ourselves as pride on the altar. Paul points this out. Because example A, when he says you're going to have to live sacrificially if you want to put others' interests above yourself, is Christ himself. And then he, not braggingly, points to himself, then he points to Timothy, and then he points to Epaphroditus. All the suffering that he's gone through, he says was worth it to this Philippian church. If I'm poured out on the altar, if I'm martyred tomorrow, it is worth it if you live the same way. They should rejoice with him, he says. That means his labor has not been in vain. He wants them to have the same mindset. He wants them to see the interest of others as more important than the interest of themselves. That their labor will not be in vain. He's challenging the Philippian church, and he's challenging us this evening. You have a choice to make as a follower of Christ. Are you going to pursue your own interest and live a non-sacrificial life? Because Christians can do that. He says, I don't have anybody like Timothy in Rome, we're going to see, that thinks like Timothy. He's the one I want to send to you because nobody else is living sacrificially like Timothy. We have to fight this. We can't be pressed into the world's mold on this, brothers and sisters. Because the society says, the American dream says this: live, make money, retire as soon as possible, do what you want to do, and soak it all in. Or as Sean Piper says, move to Florida and collect seashells. Go for the life of ease. I mentioned some wonderful saints at the beginning of this message. Jim Elliot, Elizabeth Elliot, Amy Carmichael, Gladys Allward, C.T. Studd. Why do we remember them? Because they lived lives that were not wasted on this world. They lived lives that were for the glory and the advancement of the kingdom of God. They lived sacrificially, putting the interests of others above themselves. They held out Christ to a lost and dying world. They were lights in the darkness, and they were blessed for it. Living a sacrificial life, it will be costly in one sense, but the blessings will far outweigh the cost. Paul is rejoicing here. And he's been in prison for 4 years. And he wants the Philippians to be able to rejoice. The blessing is God himself. Eric Liddell, the one that gave up the 100-meter gold medal, and by God's grace he trained for the 400, and he won that in the 1924 Paris Olympics. You know what he did after he won Olympic gold? He used his fame and everything so he could go to China. Do you know where he died? In China. You know why he died in China? Because he said, let that woman go instead of me. And he got sick and died in not a concentration camp like Auschwitz or something like that, but still a concentration camp. That's where he died. He lived for the glory of Christ. Amy Carmichael, I mentioned it this morning, not quoting it, but paraphrasing it, said this. She said, it is a blessed thing to find out that God is enough. I don't think we want to be in situations, we fight being in situations where we will find out that God is enough. He's enough. When he's enough, you won't be a grumbler. You will become a blessing to others because you will be serving others out of your relationship to Christ. Paul knows this. You'll rest in God's sovereignty also. That's the beginning of verse 19 as we dive into these verses. Paul, what is he resting in? In the beginning of verse 19, he's not grumbling. He understands that it's God's sovereign choice that he is in prison in Rome at this point in his life. That God did not mess up. It's not wrong. That's why he says, I hope in the Lord Jesus Christ to send Timothy to you soon. Why does he say, I hope in the Lord? Because he's like, if this is the Lord's will, if I'm correct, Timothy will be with you soon. But if it's not, he won't be. He is resting in God's sovereign plan for his life and for Timothy's life. I hope, he says, in the Lord Jesus. He says, I have a plan, but I'm thankful that God's in control of what's actually going to happen. If Timothy doesn't come, he could have said, God had another plan. James says that don't boast in tomorrow. That you will do this, and go in that city and make money, or this or that. Say, if the Lord wills, I will do those things. What is Paul saying here? Also, he wants to be in the Lord's will, knowing all the while he is in the Lord's will, because God has put him right where he wants him to be. But he wants to be in the Lord's will with his attitude. He doesn't want to be a grumbler. He wants to rejoice where the Lord has him, not to complain about the Lord's will in his life. And Paul is willing, also we see in verse 19, to send Timothy, his son in the faith. He is so concerned about others. He's like, I'm going to send Timothy as soon as possible. Would that have cost Paul? Yes. To send Timothy away. Timothy, most commentators believe, he is the one that's actually physically ministering to the church in Rome, because Paul, remember, he's still under house arrest, and Paul can have visitors come in and out, but Timothy is dealing with the stuff and ministering. When it says, when I find out when Paul says later on in the verses, I want to, verse 23, I hope therefore to send him as soon as I see how it will go with me. It's not referring to Paul saying, okay, let's see how my verdict goes. Paul is saying Timothy is dealing with something. Almost every commentator I read, Timothy is dealing with something probably within the church at Rome, and that has to be dealt with because Paul can't be there physically. But as soon as Timothy is done with that, I'm sending him on to you guys because I know it will encourage you. Which means Timothy is no longer in Rome. He is sending his right-hand man away. One of the faith that thinks just like him. One that has a heart for churches just like him. And he's willing to let him go. He's also willing to let Epaphroditus go back at a personal cost. To him not being there. And Timothy, Paul brags him up here. I want to be careful as we note when Paul brags him up that Paul's not tearing others down. I think he's challenging those in Rome. When he says in verse 20, for I have no one like him, who is genuinely concerned for your welfare. There is no one else here, Paul is saying with me, who has a heart for you and the churches like Timothy. And he's not referring to those outside the church. He's not referring to heretics and false teachers. He is referring to members of the Roman church. And he's like, there's no one like Timothy. They haven't grown up to where Timothy has grown up to have a heart, a sacrificial heart. Paul is making an assessment of other ministers and those that are serving in Rome, and he makes a bold claim that Timothy is the one living with the interest of the Lord in mind. And they're still living in their own interest. Verse 21. So can Christians can Christians live a life that's all about them? Yes. Will you be blessed in that life? No. Your life may be more comfortable in this world, but as a foolish choice, as Jim Elliot said. And again, I don't think Paul is slamming the others. He is contrasting their unwillingness to serve as Timothy is willing to serve. And maybe they just haven't grown up to the point to realize, oh, if I'm going to serve, it's going to cost me something. It's going to cost me. I'll have to die to myself. I'm going to have to die to my own interest. He's like, they're all seeking their own interest, not those of Christ. It blew me away when I studied that and pondered that. Paul is, again, lovingly, I think, challenging. And he probably lovingly challenged the church at Rome, and he's lovingly challenging the Philippians. He's like, don't end up like that. Be like Timothy. You've had the example of Christ. He writes about himself, what he's willing to give up for the sake of others. And now he's saying, Timothy, there's nobody else like Timothy here within the church that thinks like me, that thinks like Christ. They're wasting their time on things of this world. They're seeking their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. Well, how do you know? How do we know today if we are a self-interested person or if we're more wired like Paul and Timothy as he is challenging us? How do we grow in that? Well, we've already looked at one thing. Are you a complainer? Are you a grumbler? If we just complain about our circumstances all the time, we are not thinking of others. We've looked at that. And the other qualities we see Paul list here of Timothy, we get some other characteristics of a person that is living for the sake of others. Qualities of character of a person that is living for the sake of others. A person that is living a life for the Lord and not wasting their life. Not wasting their gifting and their talents and their time and their resources that he has given them, but giving them for the sake of others, the interest of others. First note, Timothy was willing to go. You may be thinking, well, that's not that big a deal. Yes, it was. It would have taken weeks, maybe months, for him to get back to Philippi from Rome. It's not like today. If somebody today is going to go on a missionary journey, let's say we're going to take a mission trip to Australia this year, or what is it going to be? We're all going to get our bags, we're going to go to an airport. Yeah, we're going to be on a 17-hour flight, and that's going to be cramped. Oh no. When we're going to land, we're going to be picked up by some other church, go to a nice hotel. The trip itself to Philippi from Rome would have been a long one. It would have been a dangerous one. I don't fathom that today. We think it would be uncomfortable to be on an airplane. At least I think it would be uncomfortable, and it would be uncomfortable to be on an airplane crammed in the middle seat of a middle aisle for 17 hours. No, they traveled in uncomfortable, dangerous conditions. Just picture walking, and you're walking, and this thunderstorm rolls up. What do? You get wet. Thieves come out of nowhere. What happens? You get robbed. We think, and I used to think this too when I was younger, an 8-hour car ride is the end of all things. No. Are we there yet? He was willing to go. Epaphroditus was willing to go back and suffer the toil and suffering of travel for others. They suffered while they traveled. Would you go on a mission trip that you knew was going to take you 3 weeks to get to, and it was going to be the longest, hardest journey, and you had to walk and walk and walk? Why did he go? Because he was genuinely concerned. That could be translated this: he was anxious for the spiritual well-being of the church in Philippi. When we think, wait a minute, isn't anxious a sinful word? That's probably why it wasn't translated anxious in our English Bibles, because the Bible translators were thinking it would give a negative connotation. But it should be anxious. But it's not a sinful anxiety. It's not when Jesus said, don't be anxious about your life, what you will eat or what you will wear or what you will drink. It is such a deep emotional concern about the condition of another, their spiritual condition, that it just makes you sometimes not be able to sleep. That just weighs on you. The church at Philippi was a weight on Timothy, not just Paul. Not a bad weight. Not a sinful weight. How many late night prayers did Timothy pray? How many times could he not sleep being anxious over them? Those who have a concern of others above themselves will have this weight, will have this lovely, joyful burden, this anxious burden for their well-being, their spiritual well-being. And it may wake you up. It may keep you up. Those that do not have this burden, those who do not think like Timothy, will not give up personal things for the sake of others. Jesus had this non-sinful anxiety for us and the Father's will, otherwise he never would have come. He never would have traveled the road to the cross that was set before him. How many times did Jesus go away at night to pray? What was he praying for? The spiritual condition of the disciples. He was out all night before he picked the 12. How many nights did he pray for you and I? Because he prayed for his whole church. It's an anxious burden, not a sinful burden. It's a deep emotional concern for the spiritual welfare of another, and you're willing to go the extra mile and the extra mile and the extra mile. Nobody in Rome liked Timothy. All others are thinking of their own interest. They're not thinking of the spiritual interest of others. But Timothy's coming. When it's the Lord will, he's coming. I wonder if Timothy approached Paul in this and said, I want to go, Paul. I think I can wrap this up, what I'm dealing with here. Can I go? Will you be okay if I go? Epaphroditus, I've been talking to Epaphroditus, and he's worried about this and this, and this is creeping up in the Philippian church, and I love them just as much as you, Paul, and I want to make sure they don't go off the rails. Can I go? Send me. He was a humble man. Because even if he didn't have that conversation with Paul, if Paul said, Timothy, you're going, he went. He went. He did whatever Paul thought was necessary. He submitted to the authority of Paul because he loved Paul. How many times do we read Paul said, I sent Timothy to do this, or I sent Timothy to do that, or Timothy's going to do this, or that, and Timothy, what? No, I'm not going to do that. I don't care about them. Forget them. No, he went. He could have had a ministry of his own. He could have been the lead man. I think Phil Johnson is a perfect example of this in modern day. If you ever write John MacArthur, it's Phil Johnson that put all the books together. Phil Johnson could have had his own thriving church, devout man, good preacher, and he said, no, my job was to push out the biblical teaching of MacArthur because that was the best thing for the church and for everybody else. His names are not on the books, but he's the one that put them all together. And he chose to stay second violin. That's the same with Epaphroditus. He was the one that took what was lacking in their gift, what was lacking in the Philippians' gift, that they had to physically get it to Rome. They sacrificially gave so Paul could be provided for. Remember, you had to pay for your own imprisonment then, but it still had to get to Rome. Somebody had to take the monetary gift and get it to Rome at the danger of being robbed and weeks or months to get there. It almost kills him. I'm not sure if he almost dies on his way there or the trip exhausted him so much that he got sick afterwards. And Paul said it almost killed him. He was near death, and I thank the Lord that he spared him for the sake of me. But when Epaphroditus looked like he was going to die, what was he worried about? Oh no, I don't want my brothers and sisters in Philippi to be hurting. What is this going to do to them? We don't think like this. At least I don't think like this, so you get to hear what I'm thinking tonight. We don't think like this in modern day missions. At least not everybody. We love the idea of missions. Who here and here does not love the idea of missions? To go and therefore. But what if the going meant it was the cost of your life or someone you loved dearly? We flinch at the idea of martyrdom, don't we? Missions are awesome, but not at the sake of my life or one that I love. I wouldn't rejoice in that. Paul is. What is a martyr? Someone who puts the interests of others above their own and had such a burden for the spiritual welfare of others that they were okay with the cost. Is that not the mindset of those that go? That no matter what the cost? Verse 30, again, he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me. You may think, well, I'm not thinking like that. Well, all of Rome wasn't thinking like that either. But that doesn't mean we can't grow into that thinking. Genuine God changed our desires and heartfelt thinking and the desires of our heart. I don't think today's modern church, at least in the West, thinks like this. These men were so transformed by the love of Christ that they had a heart for other brothers and sisters, no matter the cost of their personal finance, their personal health, for the sake of the spiritual interest of others. Now, I'm not saying we go looking for trouble, but I had to do a heart check. How would I respond if one of my children said, Dad, I want to go to that unreached people group that this guy just died on? Because they're still there. There's a young man, and we saw the video at Sing years 3 or 4 years ago now. He had a heart for these people. I think it was an island off of Australia. And they said, don't go, you're going to die. And he was speared to death. But he had a heart for them. I've read of a man that says, I'll be a slave. Sell me into slavery so I can go witness to slaves. That doesn't mean that's your calling, but that's the heart we're talking about here. That's the heart. That's what Paul is saying when he says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not look only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for this challenging message this evening. I thank you for challenging it in my life. Lord, we don't even want to be rejected by those we would share Christ with. At least I don't. Help me to get over myself. I want a burden for the spiritual welfare of others. I want a burden. I want to be more like Timothy. I want to be more like Paul. I want to be more like Christ. I want to have an anxiety. Oh, Lord, give that to all of us. Only you can do this. We plead with you this evening for thy will to be done in all things. Amen.